in a Benedictine monastery nestled among the rolling hills of Burgundy, where stone walls hold centuries of devotion, and the rhythm of bells marks each sacred hour. A monk named Edmund moves through his days guided by the ancient cycle of prayer. The year is 1312, and spring has arrived with birdsong and the scent of new growth. Welcome to this quiet hour of the night. I am honored to share this time with you. As darkness settles around us, we will journey together to a medieval monastery in 1312, following Edmund through the peaceful rhythms of the 7 daily prayer times. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, knowing that this story asks nothing of you but to simply listen and rest. Edmund was 41 years old, his calloused hands bearing the marks of decades spent in manual labor, his graying auburn hair cropped close in the monastic style. The first light of dawn had not yet touched the horizon when the bell for Matins rang through the darkness, its deep tone rolling across the monastery grounds and into the dormitory where Edmund slept on his simple straw mattress beneath a wool blanket. He opened his eyes without hurry. The air held the cool dampness of early morning, and he could hear the rustling of his brothers rising from their own beds, the whisper of wool robes being pulled on over linen undergarments. Edmund rose and dressed in the darkness, his fingers knowing the familiar routine without need for light. The scent of beeswax candles drifted from the chapel, where the night watchman had already lit the tapers for the coming service. The walk to the chapel took him through the covered cloister, where his leather-soled shoes made barely a sound on the smooth stone floor. Above him, stars still shone through the arched openings, and the pre-dawn chill settled against his face like a blessing. He could hear the footsteps of his brothers converging from different directions, all moving toward the same destination with the same unhurried purpose that had carried generations before them. In the chapel, the flickering candlelight cast amber shadows on the ancient stone walls. Edmund made his way to his accustomed place in the choir stalls, the worn wood smooth beneath his palms as he settled onto the bench. The abbot stood at the front, his presence calm and steady, waiting until all had gathered before beginning the opening psalm. Edmund's voice joined with those of his brothers, the Latin words flowing in familiar cadences that required no conscious thought, only the offering of breath and intention. The chanting filled the space with layers of sound that seemed to rise like incense. Edmund felt his body settle into the rhythm, his breathing matching the pace of the sung prayers. Through the high windows, he could see the gradual lightening of the sky, the stars fading as dawn approached. The service moved through its appointed readings and responses, each word a thread in the vast tapestry of monastic devotion that stretched back centuries and would continue forward into years he would never see. When Matins concluded, the monks processed out in silence, returning to the dormitory for another brief period of rest before the second bell would call them to Lauds. Edmund lay down on his mattress once more, pulling the blanket over himself. The wool held the warmth of his body, and he closed his eyes, not seeking sleep but simply resting in the darkness. Around him, the monastery held its own kind of stillness, the stones breathing with the accumulated prayers of countless mornings. The bell for Lauds came as the first true light touched the eastern sky. Edmund rose again, dressed again, walked again through the cloister where birdsong had begun to join the silence. The chapel welcomed them back, the candles now sharing their light with the pale glow coming through the windows. This service had a different quality than Matins, a sense of welcoming the day that was about to unfold. Edmund's voice blended with his brother's once more, praising the Creator for the gift of light returning to the world. He stood for the gospel reading, sat for the homily that followed. The abbot's words were few and measured, speaking of humility and patience, virtues that Edmund had spent decades trying to cultivate in the garden of his own heart. When the service ended, the monks processed to the refectory for their morning meal. Breakfast was porridge made from barley, served in wooden bowls with a portion of bread and a cup of weak ale. Edmund ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the grain and the slight sweetness that came from honey stirred into the pot. The refectory was silent except for the sound of spoons against wood and the voice of the reader, who stood at a lectern reading from the Rule of Saint Benedict while his brothers ate. Edmund listened with half his attention, the words familiar from years of hearing them, repeated in their appointed cycles. After the meal came Prime, the third of the 7 daily prayers. The monks gathered again in the chapel, their stomachs comfortable with food, their bodies awakening fully to the tasks that awaited them. This service was brief, a marking of the first hour of daylight, a blessing upon the work they were about to undertake. Edmund felt a deep contentment settle over him as he chanted, a sense of being held in something larger than himself, something that had been and would be regardless of his individual participation in it. When Prime concluded, the monks dispersed to their various laborers. Edmund made his way to the herb garden, where spring growth had begun in earnest. The earth smelled rich and alive, turned recently by Brother William, who worked alongside him in tending these beds of healing plants. Edmund knelt on the ground, feeling the dampness seep through his robe, and began to pull away the dead growth from the previous year, making space for new shoots to reach toward the light. His calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, sorting between what needed to be cleared and what should be left to grow. The morning sun climbed higher, warming his back through the wool of his habit. Bees had begun their own work among the early flowers, their humming a counterpoint to the distant sound of hammering from the carpenter's workshop and the rhythmic splash of water from the well where brothers drew up buckets for the day's needs. Hours passed in this way, his hands in the soil, his mind drifting between awareness of the task and a kind of open attention that required no particular focus. The garden was warm with captured sunlight, sheltered by the monastery walls on 2 sides. Edmund could smell the herbs beginning to release their scents as he brushed against them, the sharp clarity of rosemary, the mellow sweetness of newly sprouted mint, the earthy comfort of sage leaves unfurling from their winter dormancy. The bell for Terce rang at mid-morning, calling them from their labors back to the chapel. Edmund stood slowly, feeling his knees protest mildly after the time spent kneeling, and brushed the dirt from his hands. Brother William rose beside him, and together they walked toward the cloister, their pace leisurely, their conversation unnecessary. The chapel received them once more, the stone floor cool beneath their feet, the familiar space holding them as it had held countless others in countless previous hours. Terce was brief, acknowledging the 3rd hour of daylight, blessing the work that continued throughout the monastery grounds. Edmund's voice joined the chant, his breathing steady, his attention focused on the words that spoke of divine presence in all things. When the service ended, he returned to the garden and resumed his task, kneeling once more in the earth, his hands taking up the rhythm they had left off. By the time Sext arrived at midday, marking the 6th hour, Edmund had cleared 3 full beds of old growth and begun to turn the soil, preparing it for new plantings. The sun stood directly overhead, and sweat had begun to gather on his forehead despite the mildness of the spring day. He welcomed the bell's call, standing and stretching his back before making his way once more to the chapel. The midday service had a particular quality of stillness to it, a sense of pause at the height of the day's light. Edmund closed his eyes during the psalm singing, letting the words wash over him like water, cool and refreshing. His body felt pleasantly tired, the good fatigue of physical work done with care and attention. When Sext concluded, the monks processed to the refectory for the main meal of the day. Dinner consisted of pottage thick with vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the bakehouse, cheese aged in the monastery cellars, and more ale to drink. Edmund ate with quiet appreciation, his hunger honest from the morning's labor. The reader continued from where he had left off at breakfast, the words of ancient wisdom floating over the gathered community as they nourished their bodies for the afternoon's work ahead. After the meal came a brief period of rest, and Edmund made his way to the library where he sometimes spent his afternoon hours copying manuscripts. Today, however, the warmth of the day and the fullness in his belly drew him to the cloister garden, where he found a spot in the shade of the covered walkway and sat with his back against the cool stone wall. He did not sleep but simply rested, watching the play of light and shadow on the grass of the central garden, listening to the murmur of bees and the distant sounds of his brothers going about their various tasks. The air smelled of stone and growing things, of the incense that had been burned during the morning services, and the bread that was even now being prepared for tomorrow. Edmund felt his breathing slow, his body releasing the last tensions from the morning's work, settling into a profound ease that asked nothing and offered everything. The bell for none rang in mid-afternoon, marking the 9th hour. Edmund rose from his place in the cloister and joined the familiar procession to the chapel. This service acknowledged the declining day, the movement toward evening, the slow turn of light toward darkness. Edmund chanted with his brothers, his voice blending with theirs in harmonies that required no rehearsal, born from years of daily practice and the ancient tradition that guided their expression. When none concluded, he returned to the herb garden for the final hours of work before Vespers. The afternoon light had taken on a golden quality, softer than the harsh brightness of midday, casting longer shadows across the beds where Edmund knelt once more. He planted new seedlings that Brother Ambrose had prepared in the greenhouse, settling each tender plant into the soil with gentle firmness, pressing the earth around their roots, murmuring a silent blessing over each one. The work had a meditative quality, each action complete in itself yet part of a larger whole. Plant press moved to the next. The rhythm matched his breathing, matched the measured pace that governed all aspects of monastic life. Above him, swallows darted through the air, catching insects in flight. The monastery cat, a gray tabby named Smoke, picked her way delicately between the beds, pausing to sniff at the newly turned earth before settling in a patch of late sunlight to groom her whiskers. The bell for Vespers came as the sun approached the horizon, painting the western sky in shades of amber and rose. Edmund stood for the final time that day, his knees stiff now, his back holding the pleasant ache of honest labor. He walked to the chapel through the lengthening shadows, watching how the lowering light transformed the familiar stones, bringing out textures invisible in the flat brightness of midday. Vespers held a particular beauty, the evening prayer that marked the transition from day to night. The chapel glowed with candlelight, the windows showing the last colors of sunset. Edmund's voice rose with his brothers' voices, singing the ancient hymns of thanksgiving for the day that was ending. He felt a gentle melancholy that was not sadness, but rather an acknowledgement of time's passage, of the precious and unrepeatable nature of each moment given and now returned. When the service concluded, the monks processed to the refectory for a light evening meal of bread, cheese, and the last of the day's ale. Edmund ate slowly, savoring each bite, knowing that after this meal would come the final prayer of the day, and then the long silence of the night. The reader's voice continued its steady narration, and Edmund let the words flow past him like a stream, not grasping at meaning, but simply allowing the sound to be present. After the meal came a brief period of recreation, though the rule of silence was maintained. Edmund walked in the cloister garden as the stars began to appear overhead. Other monks walked as well, some alone, some in pairs moving side by side without need for speech. The air had cooled with the coming of night, and Edmund drew his hood over his head, feeling the wool settle against his graying auburn hair. The bell for Compline, the final prayer of the day, rang as full darkness settled over the monastery. Edmund joined his brothers one last time in the chapel, where the candles seemed brighter now against the night pressing at the windows. This service was the most intimate of the seven, a commending of the community into divine care for the hours of sleep ahead. The chant was subdued, almost a whisper, the Latin words speaking of protection and rest. When Compline ended, the monks received the abbot's blessing and processed in silence to the dormitory. Edmund removed his outer robe, folded it carefully, and lay down on his straw mattress beneath his wool blanket. The dormitory held the breathing of his brothers, the occasional shift of a body seeking comfort, the settling of the building itself as the day's warmth dissipated into the night air. Edmund closed his eyes, his body grateful for the horizontal rest, his mind quiet from the day's rhythm of prayer and work. Outside, an owl called across the monastery grounds. The stars wheeled in their appointed courses overhead. Tomorrow the cycle would begin again with matins in the darkness before dawn, and Edmund would rise to meet it with the same patient devotion he had offered this day and all the days before it. His breathing slowed, matching the deep peace that pervaded the monastery in these night hours. The 7 prayer times had marked the day like beads on a rosary, each one complete yet connected to all the others, creating a continuous offering of attention and intention. Edmund felt his consciousness beginning to drift toward sleep. His last waking thought a wordless gratitude for the structure that held him, the community that surrounded him, the ancient rhythm that would carry him through tomorrow and all the tomorrows yet to come. The darkness before dawn held Edmund in its familiar embrace when the bell for Matins sounded once more, beginning another cycle of the 7 prayer times. He opened his eyes, his body responding to the call before his mind fully woke, and reached for his outer robe in the blackness of the dormitory. The wool was cool against his skin, carrying the night's chill, and he pulled it close as he stood and made his way toward the chapel. Spring had progressed in the week since that first day, and now the pre-dawn air carried the scent of apple blossoms from the orchard beyond the monastery walls. Edmund walked through the cloister, his footsteps joining the quiet procession of his brothers, all converging on the chapel where candlelight already beckoned. The stones beneath his feet held the memory of countless such mornings, worn smooth by generations of monks making this same journey in this same darkness. In the choir stalls, Edmund settled onto his bench and felt his breathing deepen as the abbot began the opening prayer. His calloused hands rested on his knees, and he allowed his voice to join the chant, the Latin syllables flowing without conscious effort. Through the high windows, he could see no stars tonight, only the dense blackness of clouds, and he knew rain would come before the day was old. The thought brought him a quiet satisfaction, knowing the herb garden would receive water without need for carrying buckets from the well. The service moved through its appointed course, psalm following reading following response in the pattern that had shaped monastic life for centuries. Edmund's mind drifted occasionally, not away from prayer but into a deeper layer of it, where words dissolved into pure attention. He noticed how Brother Martin's voice had grown stronger since recovering from his winter cough, how the youngest novice still stumbled slightly over the Latin pronunciation, how the candle nearest the gospel book had begun to gutter and would need replacing soon. When Matins concluded, Edmund returned to the dormitory for the brief rest period before Lauds. He lay on his mattress, listening to the first drops of rain begin to tap against the roof tiles. The sound was soothing, a counterpoint to the silence, and he felt his body relax into the straw beneath him. Around him, his brothers settled into their own rest, the dormitory filling with the slow breathing of men at ease. Lauds came with gray dawn light filtering through rain-heavy clouds. Edmund rose and dressed, moving through the now familiar motions, and walked to the chapel where the candles seemed brighter against the dimness of the morning. The rain had strengthened, a steady drumming that provided a constant undertone to the chanted prayers. Edmund found comfort in the sound, in the way it enclosed the monastery in its own sphere of wet protection, separating them gently from the wider world. The gospel reading spoke of seeds and growing things, and Edmund listened with particular attention, thinking of the seedlings he had planted, wondering how they fared under this rain. The abbot's homily drew connections between the patience required for cultivation and the patience required for spiritual growth, and Edmund felt the words settle into him like the rain settling into the earth, nourishing something that grew in darkness and silence. After Lauds came breakfast in the refectory. The porridge was thick with oats today, sweetened with honey from the monastery's own hives, and Edmund ate slowly, grateful for the warmth spreading through his chest. The reader's voice rose above the quiet sounds of eating, speaking from the lives of the desert fathers, those ancient hermits who had sought God in barren places. Edmund considered the difference between their solitude and the communal solitude of the monastery, how both paths led toward the same ineffable destination. Prime followed, brief and focused, blessing the work of the day. Edmund chanted with his brothers, his voice steady, his attention on the words that acknowledged divine presence in all labor. When the service ended, he made his way not to the herb garden but to the scriptorium, where Brother Anselm had requested his help with a particularly delicate manuscript repair. The rain made outdoor work impossible, and Edmund welcomed the change in his daily rhythm. The scriptorium occupied a room on the monastery's south side, where large windows allowed maximum light during the day. Now, in the rain-dimmed morning, extra candles had been lit on each desk, their flames reflected in the glass window panes. The room smelled of ink and vellum, of the special glue made from fish bones, of the beeswax used to protect finished pages. Edmund found Brother Anselm at his desk, bent over a manuscript whose binding had come loose with age. Brother Anselm was 63 years old, his trembling hands still capable of remarkable precision, his vision keen despite his years. He looked up as Edmund approached and gestured to the damaged book without speaking, the rule of silence maintained even in this shared work. Edmund examined the manuscript, seeing where the threads had rotted away, where the vellum pages had begun to separate from their binding. He nodded his understanding and set about gathering the tools they would need, moving between the supply shelves with unhurried purpose. They worked side by side through the morning, their hands moving in coordinated silence. Edmund held pages steady, while Brother Anselm applied tiny amounts of glue with a brush made from a single horsehair. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and occasionally thunder rolled in the distance, deep and resonant. Edmund found himself settling into a profound stillness, his breathing synchronized with the careful pace of the work, his mind empty of all but the immediate task. The bell for Terce called them from the scriptorium to the chapel. Edmund stood, feeling his back protest the time spent hunched over the desk, and walked with Brother Anselm through the covered cloister. The rain had intensified, sheeting down in silver curtains beyond the protection of the arched openings. The central garden glistened with water, the grass bent beneath the downpour, and Edmund could hear the rush of water through the drainage channels that carried excess away from the monastery's foundations. Terce passed in its accustomed brevity, the monks gathering and dispersing like the rain itself, present and then gone, leaving only the residue of prayer hanging in the chapel air. Edmund returned to the scriptorium, to Brother Anselm and the damaged manuscript, and they resumed their careful restoration. The work required complete attention, yet also permitted a kind of meditation, the hands busy while the mind rested in the spacious present moment. By Sext at midday, they had reattached half the separated pages. The rain showed no sign of diminishing, and the scriptorium had grown darker despite the candles, the clouds thick and low overhead. Edmund's eyes ached slightly from the close work, and he welcomed the bell's call to the chapel. The midday service felt like a haven of rest, the chanted prayers washing through him like the rain washed through the garden outside. Dinner in the refectory was pottage made rich with spring vegetables, fresh bread, aged cheese, and ale. Edmund ate with quiet hunger, his body grateful for the nourishment after the morning's focused work. The reader continued the narrative of the Desert Fathers, and Edmund found himself thinking about the different kinds of desert, how even in this green and rain-soaked land one could find interior spaces of emptiness and silence. After the meal came the rest period, and Edmund made his way to the library where he found a spot near one of the windows overlooking the cloister garden. He sat in a wooden chair whose arms had been worn smooth by countless readers, and watched the rain transform the familiar space into something dreamlike. The steady downpour created a veil between him and the garden, softening edges, blurring distinctions, reducing the world to essential forms and the sound of water falling. He did not read but simply sat, his hands folded in his lap, his breathing slow and even. Other monks occupied other chairs nearby, some reading, some like him simply resting in the gray afternoon light. The library held the musty scent of old vellum and leather bindings, mixed now with the fresh smell of rain-washed air entering through a slightly opened window. Edmund felt his eyelids growing heavy, and he allowed them to close, not sleeping but resting in the borderland between waking and dreaming. The bell for none brought him back to full alertness. He stood and joined the procession to the chapel, his body moving through the familiar pattern, his mind quiet and clear. The afternoon service acknowledged the continuing day, the hours spent in various labors, the ongoing cycle of prayer that marked time's passage. Edmund's voice blended with his brothers' voices, creating harmonies that needed no conductor, born from years of daily practice and the ancient melodies that carried them. After none, Edmund returned to the scriptorium one final time. Brother Anselm had already resumed work on the manuscript, and Edmund took his place beside him. They completed the reattachment of the remaining pages as the afternoon wore on, their movements economical and precise. When the last page was secured, Brother Anselm closed the repaired manuscript carefully and placed it on a shelf to dry overnight. He met Edmund's eyes and nodded once, a gesture of gratitude and completion, and Edmund returned the nod, acknowledging the shared accomplishment. The rain had finally begun to ease as Vespers approached, though clouds still covered the sky. Edmund walked to the chapel through the damp air, smelling the earth's gratitude, the plants' relief, the stones' satisfaction at being washed clean. The evening prayer had a particular poignancy today, colored by the rain that had accompanied their hours, by the gray light that now filtered through the western windows showing breaks in the cloud cover. Edmund sang the evening hymns with deep feeling, not excitement but rather a profound sense of connection to this place, this community, this rhythm of prayer and work that shaped his days. When Vespers concluded, he processed to the refectory for the simple evening meal. The bread was fresh from the day's final baking, the cheese sharp and satisfying, the ale cool and mellow. Edmund ate slowly, savoring each bite, listening to the reader's voice continue the story of saints who had lived centuries ago in distant lands, their devotion echoing forward through time to reach him here in this rainy spring evening. After the meal came the brief recreation period. Edmund walked in the cloister despite the dampness, breathing the rain-washed air, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Other monks walked as well, their hoods drawn against the residual mist, their feet making soft sounds on the wet stone. No one spoke, but Edmund felt surrounded by companionship, by the silent understanding that came from years of living in close proximity with these men who shared his vows and his daily rhythm. Compline arrived as darkness completed its claim on the day. The chapel received them one last time, the candles bright against the night, the final prayers offering the community into divine care for the sleeping hours ahead. Edmund's voice joined the subdued chant, and he felt a gentle weariness settling over him, the good fatigue of a day fully lived. When the abbot offered the closing blessing, Edmund bowed his head and received it, feeling the words settle over him like a blanket. In the dormitory, he removed his outer robe and lay down on his mattress. The straw rustled beneath him, and he pulled the wool blanket close. Around him, his brothers settled into their own rest, the familiar sounds of the community preparing for sleep. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and Edmund could hear the dripping of water from the roof eaves, a peaceful counterpoint to the silence. His calloused hands rested on his chest, and he felt his breathing slow, matching the deep quietness of the monastery at night. Tomorrow would bring matins in the darkness before dawn, and the cycle would begin again, the 7 prayer times marking the hours like a thread, connecting all moments into a continuous offering. Edmund's eyes closed, his body relaxing into the mattress, his mind drifting toward sleep with the same unhurried grace that had carried him through the day. The darkness held him gently, and the monastery breathed around him, stone and wood and sleeping men all resting in the vast silence between one day and the next. The bell for matins sounded through the pre-dawn darkness, and Edmund opened his eyes to find the world transformed. Through the high dormitory windows, he could see stars scattered across a clear sky, the clouds having departed in the night. He rose from his mattress and dressed in the cool air that now carried no moisture, only the clean scent of a world washed fresh by yesterday's rain. Walking to the chapel, Edmund noticed how his breath formed small clouds in the chill, how the stones of the cloister seemed to gleam in the starlight. His brothers moved beside him in their familiar procession, shadows among shadows, all drawn toward the candle-lit warmth of the chapel. The service began with the abbot's steady voice, and Edmund felt himself settling into the rhythm of prayer as naturally as breathing, his voice joining the chant that rose through the darkness like smoke from incense. The psalms spoke of mountains and valleys, of waters covering the earth and then receding, and Edmund thought of the rain that had blessed them yesterday, now absorbed into the soil or carried away by streams toward distant rivers. His mind held these images lightly, not pursuing them, but allowing them to drift through his awareness like clouds across the sky. When matins concluded, he returned to the dormitory and lay down once more, feeling the last of the night's rest settle over him before Lauds would call them back. The second rising came easier than the first, his body now awake to the day despite the darkness that still held the world. Edmund dressed and walked to the chapel, where dawn was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pale rose and gold. The service greeted this light, the chanted prayers acknowledging the daily miracle of the sun's return, and Edmund felt a quiet joy rising in him as he sang, not excitement, but rather a deep contentment that required no expression beyond the offering of his voice. After Lauds came breakfast, and Edmund ate his porridge while listening to the reader speak of monastic foundations in Francia, of communities established centuries ago that still persisted in their devotion. The words painted pictures in his mind of other monasteries, other communities of men and women following the same rule that governed his own days, all connected through time and space by the thread of their shared commitment. The thought brought him a sense of belonging to something vast and enduring. Prime marked the beginning of work time, and Edmund made his way to the herb garden, eager to see how the plants had fared under yesterday's rain. The beds glistened with lingering moisture, and the seedlings he had planted stood straighter now, their leaves unfurled and reaching toward the morning light. Edmund knelt in the damp earth, his calloused hands beginning the day's cultivation, pulling away weeds that had sprouted overnight, loosening soil around the established plants to help them breathe. Brother William joined him after a few minutes, and they worked side by side in companionable silence. The morning sun climbed higher, warming Edmund's back through his wool robe, and he felt his muscles loosening as he moved along the beds. Bees appeared among the herb flowers, their humming a constant backdrop to the work. The scent of rosemary filled the air as Edmund's hands brushed against it, sharp and clarifying, cutting through the earthier smells of wet soil and growing things. Hours passed in this way, his hands in the earth, his mind holding the spacious quiet that came from repetitive physical labor. Edmund found himself thinking of nothing in particular, simply present with the texture of soil between his fingers, the warmth of sun on his shoulders, the distant sound of bells from the village church beyond the monastery walls. Time seemed to stretch and condense simultaneously, each moment complete yet flowing seamlessly into the next. Terce called them from the garden to the chapel, and Edmund stood slowly, his knees bearing the familiar ache of time spent kneeling. He brushed the dirt from his hands and walked through the cloister, where morning light now streamed through the arched openings, creating patterns of brightness and shadow on the stone floor. The brief service acknowledged the morning's progress, blessed the continuing work, and sent them back to their various tasks with renewed purpose. Edmund returned to the garden and took up a different tool, a small spade for transplanting seedlings that Brother Ambrose had prepared in the greenhouse. The young plants needed to be moved to their permanent locations in the beds, a delicate task requiring attention to avoid damaging tender roots. Edmund worked with deliberate care, creating a hole in the prepared soil, lifting each seedling with its surrounding ball of earth, settling it into its new home, pressing the soil firmly around it. Brother William worked nearby, doing the same task in parallel, and occasionally their eyes would meet in brief acknowledgement of the shared labor. No words passed between them, but Edmund felt a deep sense of connection in these moments, a recognition of brotherhood that went beyond language. The morning wore on, the sun climbing toward its zenith, and Edmund continued the transplanting with unhurried patience, trusting that each plant would find its way to growth in its own time. By Sext at midday, Edmund had transplanted 2 full rows of lavender seedlings, their small gray-green leaves already releasing subtle fragrance in the warmth. The bell called him to the chapel, and he stood with gratitude for the opportunity to straighten his back, to walk through the cool cloister to the even cooler chapel where the midday service waited. The prayers acknowledged the sun at its height, the halfway point of daylight, and Edmund felt balanced between morning and afternoon, held in the present moment by the structure of the prayer times. Dinner in the refectory featured fresh greens from the monastery garden, the first harvest of spring, mixed into the pottage along with herbs that Edmund himself had dried the previous fall. He tasted his own labor in the meal, the sage and thyme adding depth to the vegetables and barley, and felt a quiet pride in this contribution to the community's nourishment. The reader's voice rose and fell in familiar patterns, and Edmund let the words wash over him without grasping at their meaning, simply allowing the sound to be present. After the meal came the rest period, and Edmund found himself drawn back to the library, to the same chair near the window where he had sat during yesterday's rain. Today the view showed the cloister garden in full sun, the grass almost luminous in its greenness, the flower beds bright with early blooms. He sat and watched the play of light, noticing how shadows moved across the garden as clouds passed overhead, how the breeze stirred the grass in waves like water. His breathing slowed, his body relaxing into the chair's embrace. Other monks read or rested nearby, creating a shared atmosphere of peaceful quiet. Edmund felt his eyelids growing heavy, not from true sleepiness but from the deep contentment that made rest possible. He allowed his eyes to close, and behind his eyelids he saw the garden still, illuminated now by memory rather than direct sight, and he rested in that interior vision until the bell for none called him back. The afternoon service had a particular sweetness today, colored by the sunshine streaming through the chapel windows, by the knowledge that spring was truly establishing itself after the long winter. Edmund's voice joined his brothers' voices in thanksgiving, in acknowledgement of gifts received and gifts yet to come. When none concluded, he made his way not back to the garden but to the monastery kitchen, where Brother Benedict had requested help preparing herbs for drying. The kitchen occupied a large room with a massive fireplace at one end and long wooden tables filling the central space. Brother Benedict was 57 years old, his round face perpetually flushed from the heat of cooking, his competent hands moving with practiced efficiency. He greeted Edmund with a nod and gestured to bundles of fresh herbs waiting on one of the tables, thyme and oregano and marjoram gathered that morning from the garden. Edmund set to work sorting through the bundles, removing any damaged leaves, tying the stems together with hemp twine in bunches that would hang properly for drying. The kitchen smelled of bread baking in the oven, of herbs both fresh and dried, of the perpetual simmering of the stock pot that provided base for all the monastery's soups and pottages. Edmund found the warmth comfortable after the hours spent kneeling in the garden, and he worked with steady focus, his calloused hands moving through the familiar motions. Brother Benedict moved around the kitchen tending various tasks, and occasionally their paths would cross as Edmund reached for more twine or Benedict checked the bread in the oven. These near encounters had a quality of gentle choreography, each man aware of the other's movements, adjusting without conscious thought to avoid collision. Edmund felt held by this unspoken cooperation, by the way the monastery's life consisted of countless such moments of wordless coordination. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen's high windows, and Edmund worked steadily through the piles of herbs, creating neat bundles that Brother Benedict hung from the ceiling beams to dry. The scent intensified as more herbs joined those already suspended overhead, and Edmund breathed deeply, feeling the aromatic air fill his lungs and settle into his body. His hands moved without need for conscious direction, freed by years of practice to work, while his mind rested in open awareness. Vespers approached as Edmund tied the final bundle, and he washed his hands in a basin of water, feeling the herb oils gradually releasing from his skin. The walk to the chapel took him through lengthening shadows, the afternoon giving way to early evening, and he felt the familiar shift that came with this time of day, a gentle melancholy that was not sadness, but rather acknowledgement of time's passage, of each day being both gift and loss. The evening prayer gathered the community once more in the chapel, where candles had been lit against the approaching darkness. Edmund's voice rose with his brothers' voices, singing the ancient hymns that marked the day's ending, that offered gratitude for hours lived and work accomplished. Through the western windows, he could see the sky taking on shades of amber and rose, the sun descending toward the horizon, and he felt his heart expanding to hold both the beauty of the moment and the knowledge of its inevitable passing. When Vespers concluded, the monks processed to the refectory for the simple evening meal. Edmund ate bread and cheese, drank his portion of ale, and listened to the reader continue the lives of the saints. The stories spoke of devotion sustained over decades, of faithfulness maintained through difficulty and ease alike, and Edmund felt these narratives settling into him as examples and encouragement. His own life might not achieve such heights of holiness, but perhaps the daily showing up, the constant returning to the rhythm of prayer and work, carried its own kind of sanctity. After the meal came the brief recreation time, and Edmund walked in the cloister as the stars began appearing overhead. The air had cooled significantly, and he drew his hood over his graying auburn hair, feeling the wool settle against his skin. Other monks walked nearby, their presence a comfort in the gathering darkness. No words were needed or offered, only the shared experience of moving through the evening together, held in the structure that governed all their days. Compline came as full darkness claimed the sky, and the monks gathered one final time in the chapel for the day's last prayer. The service was subdued, almost whispered, the words commending them into divine care for the sleeping hours ahead. Edmund felt a deep weariness settling over him, the good fatigue of a day fully inhabited, and when the abbot offered the closing blessing, he received it with bowed head and open heart. In the dormitory, Edmund removed his outer robe and lay down on his mattress beneath his wool blanket. Around him, his brothers settled into their own rest, the dormitory filling with the slow breathing of men at peace. Outside, an owl called across the monastery grounds, and Edmund listened to its voice carrying through the darkness. His calloused hands rested on his chest, and he felt his breathing matching the deep quietness of the night. Tomorrow would bring matins in the darkness before dawn, and the 7 prayer times would mark another day's passing, another cycle of the eternal rhythm that held him. Edmund's eyes closed, his body releasing into sleep. His last conscious thought a wordless gratitude for the gift of this life, for the community that surrounded him, for the ancient pattern that carried him forward day by day toward a destination he could not name but trusted absolutely. The bell for matins rang through the darkness, and Edmund rose from his mattress with the ease that came from decades of this same rising. The air held a particular stillness this morning, neither warm nor cold, simply present and waiting. He dressed in the blackness of the dormitory, his fingers finding the familiar folds of his robe without need for sight, and joined the quiet procession of his brothers moving toward the chapel through the starlit cloister. In the choir stalls, Edmund settled onto his bench and felt the day beginning to take shape around him. The abbot's voice opened the service, and Edmund's own voice joined the chant, the Latin words flowing in patterns worn smooth by centuries of repetition. Through the high windows he could see the stars fading as dawn approached, and he thought of how many monks in how many monasteries across Christendom were at this moment offering these same prayers, their voices joining in a vast chorus that spanned distances his feet would never travel. The service moved through its appointed course, and Edmund found his attention deepening rather than wandering, each word seeming to carry more weight this morning, more presence. He noticed the quality of candlelight on stone, the way Brother Martin's voice had found a new confidence in the chanting, the scent of beeswax mixing with the faint smell of morning damp rising from the earth. When Matins concluded, he returned to the dormitory for a brief rest before Lauds, lying on his mattress and listening to the first birds beginning their own morning songs. Lauds came with gray light spreading across the eastern sky, and Edmund walked to the chapel feeling his body fully awakening to the day. The service welcomed the returning light, and Edmund sang with particular attention to the words of praise, feeling them as truth rather than merely formula. The gospel reading spoke of lilies of the field and birds of the air, of divine provision woven into the fabric of creation, and Edmund thought of the herb garden, of seeds becoming plants becoming medicine, the whole cycle a continuous gift requiring only his patient cooperation. After Lauds came breakfast, and Edmund ate his porridge slowly, tasting the grain and honey as though for the first time. The reader's voice spoke of early monastic communities in Egypt and Syria, of hermits who had sought God in desert caves and found him in the silence between their heartbeats. Edmund considered how the monastery provided its own kind of desert, not of sand and sun, but of routine and repetition, how the daily cycle could hollow out space within the soul for something vast to enter. Prime blessed the beginning of work, and Edmund made his way to the herb garden where morning dew still clung to every leaf and blade of grass. The seedlings he had transplanted yesterday stood firm in their new locations, and he felt a quiet satisfaction seeing them established. Today's task was weeding the established beds, pulling away the unwanted growth that competed with the herbs for light and nourishment. He knelt in the damp earth, his calloused hands beginning the familiar work, and settled into the rhythm of pull and toss, his breath matching the motions. Brother William arrived and took up his own section of the beds, and they worked in parallel through the morning. The sun climbed higher, burning away the dew, warming the air until Edmund could feel sweat beginning to gather on his forehead. He paused occasionally to straighten his back, to look up at the sky where clouds were building in white towers to the west. More rain would come, perhaps by afternoon, and the thought pleased him as he returned his attention to the weeds. The garden was alive with activity beyond his own labor. Bees moved from flower to flower with purposeful industry. A thrush sang from the wall's top, its voice liquid and clear. The monastery cat appeared and wound between the planted rows, investigating scents invisible to human awareness before settling in a patch of sunlight to groom her gray fur. Edmund watched her for a moment, noting the completeness with which she inhabited each action, how nothing in her suggested division between doing and being. Terce called them from the garden to the chapel, and Edmund stood and brushed the dirt from his hands and knees. The brief service acknowledged the morning's progress, and Edmund chanted with his brothers, his voice steady and sure. When Terce concluded, he returned to the garden and resumed his weeding, working now in a different bed where mint had begun to spread beyond its appointed boundaries. The task required care to remove the excess without damaging the plants that should remain, and Edmund gave it his full attention, his mind empty of all but the immediate judgment his hands required. By Sext at midday, he had cleared 3 full beds and begun work on a 4th. The clouds had thickened overhead, blocking the sun, and a cool breeze had risen, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Edmund welcomed the change, feeling the air's moisture on his face as he walked to the chapel for the midday service. The prayers acknowledged the height of day, and Edmund felt himself balanced between morning and afternoon, held in the eternal present that the prayer times continually created. Dinner in the refectory was pottage thick with spring vegetables, bread warm from the morning's baking, cheese sharp and satisfying. Edmund ate with quiet hunger, his body grateful for the nourishment after the morning's labor. The reader's voice continued the narrative of desert monasticism, and Edmund listened with half his attention, the other half resting in simple awareness of taste and texture, of warmth spreading through his chest as he swallowed. After the meal came the rest period, but instead of going to the library, Edmund found himself drawn to the chapel. He entered the empty space and sat in his accustomed place in the choir stalls, not to pray in any formal sense, but simply to be present in the silence. The chapel held a particular quality when empty of community, a stillness that felt both welcoming and vast. Edmund sat with his hands folded in his lap, his breathing slow and even, and allowed the silence to settle over him like a blessing. Time passed without measure. Edmund did not count breaths or recite prayers, but simply sat, aware of the stone beneath him, the air moving gently through the space, the distant sound of rain beginning to fall on the roof tiles. His mind grew quiet, not empty but spacious, holding everything without grasping at anything. He thought of the 41 years he had lived, the 23 of them spent within these walls, and felt no regret for paths not taken, only gratitude for the path that had brought him to this moment. The bell for none called him from his meditation, and he remained seated as his brothers filed in for the afternoon service. Brother William took the place beside him and glanced over with a slight smile, acknowledging Edmund's early presence without need for words. The service began, and Edmund's voice joined the chant, feeling how the time of silent sitting had opened something within him, making space for the prayers to resonate more deeply. After none, Edmund returned to the herb garden despite the rain that had now established itself as a steady downpour. He worked in the wet, his robe quickly soaking through, pulling weeds that came easily from the softened soil. The rain was warm for spring, and he found he did not mind the water running down his face, dripping from his hood. There was something purifying about working in the rain, as though he were being washed clean along with the plants and earth around him. Brother William joined him after a few minutes, apparently having the same thought about the ease of weeding in wet soil. They worked together through the afternoon, two figures moving through the rain-dimmed garden, their hands in the earth, their robes heavy with water. Edmund felt a profound contentment in the work, in the shared commitment to complete the task regardless of weather, in the simple reality of rain and soil and growing things. By the time Vespers approached, the rain had gentled to a drizzle. Edmund stood from the last bed, now completely weeded, and walked to the chapel, leaving wet footprints on the cloister stones. In the dormitory, he changed into a dry robe, hanging the wet one to dry overnight. The evening prayer gathered the community, and Edmund sang the hymns with particular feeling, his body tired in the best way, his mind clear and peaceful. When Vespers concluded, they processed to the refectory for the simple evening meal. Edmund ate bread and cheese, drank his ale, and felt the warmth returning to his core. The reader's voice spoke of saints who had found holiness not through dramatic gestures, but through faithful attention to daily tasks, through decades of showing up and doing what was asked. Edmund recognized his own life in these stories and felt affirmed in his choices, in the path that had seemed so ordinary yet had brought him to this place of deep peace. After the meal came recreation, and Edmund walked in the cloister despite the continuing drizzle. Other monks walked as well, their hoods drawn against the rain, their presence a comfort in the wet darkness. The air smelled of rain-soaked stone and earth, of night-blooming flowers opening in the monastery garden. Edmund breathed deeply, feeling the cool air enter his lungs, and thought of nothing, simply walking and breathing and being present. Compline gathered them one final time, the day's last prayer offered in the candle-lit chapel. The service was subdued, the words speaking of rest and trust, of surrender into care beyond human capacity. Edmund sang with his brothers, his voice blending with theirs in harmonies that required no thought, born from years of daily practice. When the abbot offered the closing blessing, Edmund bowed his head and received it, feeling the words settle over him like his wool blanket would soon settle over his body. In the dormitory, he lay down on his mattress and pulled the blanket close. His body ached pleasantly from the day's work, and he felt the fatigue pulling him toward sleep. Around him, his brothers settled into their own rest, the dormitory filling with the sound of slow breathing. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion, and Edmund listened to it as his eyes closed, as his breathing slowed, as consciousness began to release its hold. His calloused hands rested on his chest, and he felt them as extensions of the larger body of the monastery, of the community that worked and prayed as one organism. Tomorrow would bring Matins in the darkness before dawn, and the cycle would continue, the 7 prayer times marking another day's passage. Edmund's last waking thought was a wordless offering of gratitude, and then sleep claimed him, gentle and complete, carrying him into the darkness where all distinctions dissolved into simple rest. The rain fell steadily through the night, blessing the earth, filling the cisterns, washing the monastery stones clean once more. The bell for Matins sounded through the darkness, and Edmund woke to find the rain had stopped in the night. He rose from his mattress and dressed, his body moving through the familiar motions while his mind remained soft with sleep. Walking to the chapel, he noticed how the air had changed, carrying now the rich scent of wet earth and the promise of clearing skies. Stars appeared and disappeared behind ragged clouds that raced across the heavens, and Edmund watched their movement as he crossed the cloister. In the choir stalls, he settled onto his bench and allowed his breathing to deepen as the service began. The abbot's voice opened the prayers, and Edmund joined the chant, feeling how the Latin syllables had become a kind of second language to his soul, speaking truths that went beyond the meaning of individual words. The candlelight flickered as a breeze found its way through some gap in the chapel walls, and Edmund watched the shadows dance on the ancient stones, thinking of all the other monks who had watched these same shadows over the centuries. The Psalms this morning spoke of waters and floods, of God's voice thundering over mighty seas, and Edmund thought of yesterday's rain, of how even the smallest storm participated in the vast cycles that governed earth and sky. His voice rose and fell with his brothers' voices, creating harmonies that felt less like sound and more like architecture, invisible structures built from breath and intention. When Matins concluded, he returned to the dormitory and lay down once more, but sleep did not return. Instead, he rested in a state of quiet wakefulness, listening to the night sounds gradually giving way to the first stirrings of dawn. Lauds came with the eastern sky beginning to pale, clouds lit from beneath by the approaching sun. Edmund walked to the chapel feeling fully present to the new day, his senses alert to every detail. The service welcomed the returning light, and Edmund sang the prayers of thanksgiving with particular attention to the words about creation, about how all things spoke of divine presence for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. The gospel reading told of the sower going out to sow, and Edmund considered how his own work in the herb garden mirrored this parable, how some seeds flourished while others struggled, all according to patterns beyond his control. After Lauds came breakfast, and Edmund ate his porridge while the reader spoke of Saint Benedict's instructions for receiving guests, how every visitor should be welcomed as Christ himself. The words reminded Edmund of his own arrival at the monastery 23 years ago, a young man of 18 seeking something he could not name, finding it gradually through the daily repetition of prayer and work. He remembered his own uncertainty in those early years, how the structure had eventually become not constraint but freedom, the rhythm of the hours creating space for his soul to expand rather than contract. Prime blessed the beginning of work, and Edmund made his way to the infirmary rather than the garden. Brother Matthias, who tended the sick, had sent word that he needed fresh herbs for medicines, and Edmund had promised to bring them this morning. He gathered a basket from the storage room and walked to the herb garden, where the plants glistened with lingering moisture from yesterday's rain. His calloused hands moved among the growth, selecting leaves and stems with practiced judgment, taking only what could be spared while leaving enough for the plants to continue thriving. The morning sun broke through the clouds as he worked, sending shafts of golden light across the garden. Edmund paused in his gathering to watch the illumination transform the ordinary space into something luminous, each water droplet catching and refracting the light like tiny jewels. The moment passed as all moments did, the clouds shifting, the light changing, But Edmund carried the memory of it as he continued filling his basket with sage and thyme, with chamomile flowers and mint leaves. When the basket was full, he carried it to the infirmary, a long room on the monastery's east side where windows admitted morning light. Brother Matthias was 70 years old, his bent frame still moving with surprising quickness, his keen eyes missing nothing. He nodded his thanks as Edmund set the basket on the work table and began sorting the herbs, separating them by type, laying them out to be processed according to their different uses. Edmund remained to help with the preparation, and they worked side by side through the morning. Some herbs needed to be stripped from their stems, others chopped finely, still others left whole to steep in hot water or oil. The work required attention but permitted a meditative quality, the hands busy while the mind rested in the spacious present. Brother Matthias hummed softly as he worked, an old plain-song melody that Edmund recognized from the divine office, and Edmund found himself humming along, their voices creating a quiet harmony in the sun-filled room. The bell for Terce called them to the chapel, and Edmund washed his hands in a basin of water, feeling the herb oils slowly releasing from his skin. The brief service acknowledged the morning's progress, blessed the continuing work, and Edmund chanted with particular awareness of how this prayer time served as both interruption and continuation, breaking the work rhythm while simultaneously deepening it through the offering of attention to something beyond the immediate task. Returning to the infirmary, Edmund and Brother Matthias resumed their preparation of the herbs. The older monk showed Edmund how to make a particular salve for treating minor wounds, mixing rendered fat with crushed herbs in precise proportions, heating the mixture gently over a small brazier until the plant matter released its healing properties into the fat. Edmund watched with close attention, noting the color changes that indicated proper temperature, the consistency that showed the salve was ready to be strained and poured into small ceramic pots for storage. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that came from years of shared labor, where words were unnecessary because understanding ran deeper than language. Edmund found himself thinking about healing, about how it required both knowledge and patience, how the herbs offered their gifts freely, but only to those who knew how to ask properly, how to prepare and administer in ways that honored the plant's nature while serving human need. By Sext at midday, they had prepared 3 different salves and 2 tinctures, along with bundles of dried herbs ready for steeping into teas. The workspace smelled intensely of the various plants, and Edmund breathed deeply, feeling the aromatic compounds entering his lungs, becoming part of his body through the simple act of respiration. The bell called them to the chapel, and he walked through the cloister, noticing how the sun had climbed to its zenith, how shadows had shrunk to small pools directly beneath objects. The midday service felt like a pause at the top of a breath, a moment of perfect balance before the exhale of afternoon began. Edmund sang the prayers with deep appreciation for this structure that punctuated the day, that prevented work from becoming mere labor by continually returning attention to the source from which all activity flowed. When Sext concluded, they processed to the refectory for dinner. The meal featured fish from the monastery's ponds, baked with herbs that Edmund himself had grown and dried the previous summer. He He tasted his own work in the seasoning, the subtle flavor of dill and parsley complementing the mild flesh of the fish. Fresh bread and early lettuce from the garden completed the meal, along with the ever-present ale. The reader's voice spoke of monastic observances in distant lands, of communities in Ireland and Northumbria who followed similar rules in different landscapes, and Edmund felt connected to this vast network of prayer spreading across Christendom. After the meal came the rest period, and Edmund made his way to his favorite chair in the library. He sat near the window overlooking the cloister garden, where afternoon sun now illuminated the space with particular clarity. He did not read but simply rested, watching the play of light and shadow, noticing how the breeze stirred the grass in patterns that suggested invisible currents moving through the visible world. His breathing slowed, his body releasing the morning's accumulated tensions, and he felt himself sinking into a profound ease that asked nothing and offered everything. The bell for none brought him back to fuller alertness, though he realized he had not actually been asleep, merely resting in that borderland where consciousness softened its boundaries. He stood and walked to the chapel, where the afternoon service gathered the community once more. Edmund's voice joined his brother's voices in the familiar chants, and he felt how these prayers had become woven into the fabric of his being, how he could no more separate himself from them than from his own breath. After none, Edmund returned to the herb garden to complete some planting he had begun earlier in the week. The soil was still moist from yesterday's rain, perfect for transplanting, and he worked with careful attention to settle new seedlings into their permanent locations. The afternoon sun warmed his back as he knelt in the earth, and he found himself moving into that state of absorbed focus where time seemed to both stretch and compress, where hours could pass like minutes, yet each moment felt complete in itself. Brother William appeared after a while and began working in an adjacent bed, and they labored together through the afternoon in their usual silence. Edmund felt grateful for this companionship, for the way shared work created bonds that went deeper than conversation. They had worked together for nearly 15 years now, and Edmund knew Brother William's rhythms as well as his own, could anticipate his movements, could coordinate their efforts without need for discussion. The clouds had cleared completely by the time Vespers approached, and the western sky blazed with color as the sun descended toward the horizon. Edmund stood from his work and walked to the chapel through the golden light of late afternoon, feeling a quiet joy rising in him at the beauty of the ordinary world made extraordinary by the angle of illumination. The evening prayer gathered the community, and Edmund sang the hymns with full voice, offering his gratitude for the gift of another day lived within this rhythm. When Vespers concluded, they processed to the refectory for the simple evening meal. Edmund ate bread and cheese, drank his ale, and listened to the reader continue the lives of the saints. The stories spoke of perseverance, of faith maintained through decades of ordinary days punctuated by moments of clarity, and Edmund recognized his own journey in these narratives. His life had contained no dramatic events, no visions or miracles, yet somehow it had brought him to a place of deep contentment, of peace that surpassed understanding. After the meal came recreation, and Edmund walked in the cloister as the first stars appeared overhead. The air had cooled with evening's arrival, and he drew his hood over his graying auburn hair, feeling the wool settle against his skin. Other monks walked nearby, their presence a comfort in the gathering darkness. Edmund thought of nothing, simply placing one foot before the other, breathing the cool air, existing in the spacious present that the day's rhythm had created and sustained. Compline gathered them one final time, the day's last prayer offered in the candle-lit chapel. The service commended them into divine care for the sleeping hours ahead, and Edmund sang the subdued chants with particular tenderness, feeling how vulnerable they all were in sleep, how trust was required to release consciousness each night into the unknown. When the abbot offered the closing blessing, Edmund received it with bowed head and open heart, feeling the words settle over him like protection against the night. In the dormitory, he removed his outer robe and lay down on his mattress beneath his wool blanket. His calloused hands rested on his chest, and he felt his breathing slowing, matching the deep quietness that pervaded the monastery in these night hours. Around him, his brothers settled into their own rest, the dormitory filling with the sound of men at peace. Outside, the night held its vast silence, and Edmund let himself be held by it, his consciousness gradually releasing its grip on wakefulness. His last thought before sleep claimed him was a wordless awareness of gratitude, of being held within something larger than himself, something that had been and would be regardless of his individual participation, yet somehow was enriched by his daily offering of attention and intention. The 7 prayer times had marked another day's passage, and tomorrow they would mark another, and so on through all the days remaining to him. The darkness gathered him in, and Edmund slept, his breathing slow and even, his body at rest, his soul cradled in the ancient rhythm that held all things. The bell for Matins rang through the pre-dawn darkness, and Edmund rose from his mattress feeling the weight of 41 years settling gently into his bones. He dressed in the cool air, his calloused hands finding the familiar fabric of his robe, and walked through the starlit cloister toward the chapel where candlelight already beckoned. The stones beneath his feet held the accumulated prayers of centuries, and he felt himself part of an unbroken chain stretching backward into time and forward into futures he would never witness. In the choir stalls, Edmund settled onto his bench and felt his breathing deepen as the abbot began the opening prayer. His voice joined the chant, the Latin words flowing without conscious effort, and he noticed how the service had become less something he did and more something that moved through him, as natural as breath itself. The psalms spoke of darkness and light, of valleys and mountaintops, and Edmund held these images lightly, allowing them to illuminate his interior landscape without demanding interpretation. When Matins concluded, he returned to the dormitory and lay down once more, but instead of closing his eyes, he found himself staring at the wooden beams overhead, thinking about the progression of seasons, how spring was now fully established, how summer would come, and then autumn and winter in their appointed times. The thought brought him neither anxiety nor anticipation, only a quiet acceptance of the cycles that governed all created things. He closed his eyes and rested in this acceptance until the bell for Lauds called him back to wakefulness. The dawn service welcomed the returning light, and Edmund sang the prayers with particular attention to the words about renewal, about each day offering new mercy, new possibility. The gospel reading told of workers in a vineyard, hired at different hours yet all receiving the same wage, and Edmund contemplated the mystery of grace, how it came not as payment earned but as a gift freely offered. The abbot's brief homily explored this theme, and Edmund felt the words settling into him like seeds finding soil. After Lauds came breakfast, and Edmund ate his porridge while listening to the reader speak of monastic reforms in various regions, of communities rediscovering the simplicity of the rule after periods of drift and elaboration. The narrative reminded Edmund of his own journey, how he had come to the monastery seeking something complex and found instead something profoundly simple. The daily repetition of prayer and work gradually hollowing out space within him for something vast to dwell. Prime blessed the beginning of work, and Edmund made his way to the scriptorium where Brother Anselm had requested his help with another manuscript project. The writing room was quiet this morning, only 3 monks present at their desks, and Edmund took his place at an empty table where materials had been laid out for him. The task was to prepare new vellum pages for copying, scraping the calfskin smooth with a curved blade, marking guidelines with a lead point, and preparing the surface to receive ink. The work required steady concentration, the blade moving across the vellum in long strokes that removed any remaining irregularities from the surface. Edmund found his breathing synchronizing with the motion, inhaling as the blade moved forward, exhaling as it returned. The vellum gradually became smoother under his attention, transforming from raw material into something ready to bear sacred words. He thought about how similar this was to the spiritual life, the slow, patient work of preparation, of making oneself ready to receive what could not be grasped or forced. Brother Anselm worked nearby, his trembling hands somehow still capable of the fine brushwork required for illuminated capitals. Edmund glanced over occasionally and watched the older monk apply gold leaf to a letter, the thin sheets of metal adhering to the sized surface, catching and reflecting the morning light streaming through the windows. The beauty of the work struck Edmund each time he witnessed it, how something so delicate could endure for centuries if properly cared for, how human craft could create vessels for divine truth. The bell for Terce interrupted their work, and Edmund set aside his blade and walked to the chapel with the others. The brief service acknowledged the morning's progress, and Edmund chanted with his brothers, his voice steady and sure. When Terce concluded, he returned to the scriptorium and resumed his preparation of the vellum, working through several more pages before the surface quality satisfied his judgment. By late morning, he had prepared a stack of pages ready for the scribes to use. Brother Anselm examined them with his keen eyes and nodded his approval, a gesture that brought Edmund quiet satisfaction. They worked together then on organizing the scriptorium's supplies, counting quills and checking ink levels, ensuring everything was ready for the copying work that would continue through the coming weeks. The room smelled of vellum and oak gall ink, of the beeswax used to seal finished pages, and Edmund breathed deeply, finding comfort in these familiar scents. Sext at midday called them to the chapel, where the prayers acknowledged the sun at its height. Edmund felt balanced between morning and afternoon, held in the present moment by the structure of the prayer times. His voice joined his brother's voices in the familiar chants, and he felt how these repeated prayers had become a kind of anchor, keeping him grounded in the midst of time's constant flow. Dinner in the refectory featured pottage made with early peas from the garden, their sweetness a welcome addition to the barley and herbs. Edmund ate slowly, savoring the flavors, listening to the reader speak of monastic foundations in Germania, of communities establishing themselves in forests and mountains, bringing prayer and cultivation to wild places. The stories painted pictures in his mind of other monks in other landscapes, all following the same essential rhythm that governed his own days. After the meal came the rest period, and Edmund found himself drawn to the chapter house, a room where the community gathered each morning after prime to hear a chapter from the rule read aloud. Now, in the quiet afternoon, the space was empty, and Edmund sat on one of the stone benches that lined the walls. He closed his eyes and simply rested, not seeking anything, not avoiding anything, simply present to the silence and the play of light through the room's arched windows. Time passed without measure. Edmund's breathing slowed to match the deep quiet of the space, and he felt himself sinking into a profound stillness where the boundaries between interior and exterior seemed to soften. He was not praying in any formal sense, yet everything felt like prayer, the simple act of sitting and breathing and being present. When the bell for none eventually called him from this rest, he rose feeling refreshed in ways that had nothing to do with physical recuperation. The afternoon service gathered the community once more, and Edmund's voice joined the chant with renewed clarity. The prayers acknowledged the continuing day, blessed the work that remained, and sent them back to their various tasks with quiet purpose. Edmund made his way to the monastery vineyard, where Brother Philip needed help tying the new vine growth to the wooden trellises that supported them. The vineyard occupied a south-facing slope beyond the main monastery buildings, where the soil drained well, and the vines received maximum sunlight. Edmund walked among the rows, his calloused hands gently gathering the tender shoots and securing them to the supports with strips of soft cloth. The work required care to avoid damaging the delicate growth, and he moved with unhurried attention, ensuring each vine was properly positioned to receive light and air. Brother Philip was 61 years old, his weathered face creased with lines that spoke of decades spent outdoors, his movements economical and precise. He worked several rows ahead of Edmund, and they progressed through the vineyard in comfortable parallel, each at his own pace. The afternoon sun warmed Edmund's back, and he felt sweat gathering on his forehead as he worked, the physical exertion pleasant after the morning's more sedentary tasks in the scriptorium. Birds sang from the hedgerows that bordered the vineyard, and Edmund paused occasionally to listen, to watch their movement among the branches. A pair of finches had nested nearby, and he could hear their calls as they flew back and forth bringing food to their young. The sound reminded him of the abbey's own rhythms, the constant tending and nurturing that life required, the daily attention to needs both physical and spiritual. The afternoon wore on, and Edmund continued his steady progress through the vine rows. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, gathering and tying, the repetitive motion creating a meditative quality that allowed his mind to rest while his body worked. He thought of nothing in particular, simply present with the texture of the vine shoots, the warmth of the sun, the distant sound of bells from the village church marking the hours for those who lived beyond the monastery walls. Vespers approached as shadows began lengthening across the vineyard. Edmund completed his current row and walked back toward the main buildings with brother Philip, both of them tired in the good way that came from honest labor. The chapel welcomed them, and Edmund took his place in the choir stalls for the evening prayer. His voice rose with his brothers' voices, singing the hymns that marked the day's ending, that offered gratitude for hours lived and work accomplished. Through the western windows, the sky had taken on shades of amber and rose, the sun descending toward the horizon. Edmund watched the light change as he sang, feeling how the beauty of these moments somehow gathered up all the ordinary hours of the day and revealed their hidden radiance. When Vespers concluded, they processed to the refectory for the simple evening meal. Edmund ate bread and cheese, drank his ale, and listened to the reader continue the lives of the saints. The stories spoke of faithfulness maintained through long years of obscurity, of holiness cultivated in the soil of daily routine rather than dramatic gesture. Edmund felt these narratives affirming his own path, validating the choice to seek God not through extraordinary means, but through the extraordinary patience required to show up each day and offer what was asked. After the meal came recreation, and Edmund walked in the cloister as the first stars appeared overhead. The air had cooled with evening's arrival, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers from the monastery garden. Other monks walked nearby, their presence a comfort in the gathering darkness. Edmund breathed deeply, feeling the day's accumulated experiences settling into his body, becoming part of the long memory that shaped who he was becoming. Compline gathered them one final time, the day's last prayer offered in the candlelit chapel. The service was subdued, the words speaking of rest and trust, of surrender into care beyond human understanding. Edmund sang with his brothers, his voice blending with theirs in harmonies that required no thought, and when the abbot offered the closing blessing, he received it with bowed head and grateful heart. In the dormitory, Edmund removed his outer robe and lay down on his mattress beneath his wool blanket. His calloused hands rested on his chest, and he felt his breathing slowing, matching the deep quietness of the monastery at night. Around him, his brothers settled into their own rest, and Edmund listened to the sound of their breathing, thinking how they were all held together in this shared rhythm, this common offering of their days to something larger than any individual life. His eyes closed, and he felt consciousness beginning to release its hold, the day dissolving into the darkness from which morning would eventually emerge. Tomorrow would bring matins in the pre-dawn hours, and the 7 prayer times would mark another day's passage, another cycle of the eternal rhythm that held him. Edmund's last waking thought was a wordless offering of gratitude, and then sleep claimed him, gentle and complete, carrying him into the vast silence where all distinctions dissolved and only peace remained. The night deepened around the monastery, holding it in stillness, and the stars wheeled overhead in their appointed courses, marking time in ways beyond human measure. The bell for matins sounded through the darkness, and Edmund opened his eyes to find the night still deep and starless, clouds having returned to cover the sky. He rose from his mattress and dressed, his body moving through the familiar sequence while his mind remained soft and receptive. Walking to the chapel, he noticed how the air held a peculiar density, neither warm nor cold, simply present and waiting. The stones of the cloister seemed to absorb sound, and his footsteps made barely a whisper as he joined the quiet procession of his brothers. In the choir stalls, Edmund settled onto his bench and felt the day beginning to take shape in the darkness around him. The abbot's voice opened the service, and Edmund joined the chant, his voice blending with his brothers' voices to create something larger than any individual contribution. The psalms this morning spoke of hiding and refuge, of finding shelter in the shadow of wings, and Edmund thought about the monastery itself as a kind of shelter, not from the world but from the world's constant demand for novelty and distraction. The service moved through its appointed course, and Edmund found his attention settling into a deeper layer of awareness, where the words became less important than the act of offering them, where meaning dissolved into pure presence. When Matins concluded, he returned to the dormitory and lay down once more, listening to the darkness, to the breathing of his brothers, to the vast silence that held all sound within it like a vessel holding water. Lauds came with no visible dawn, the clouds too thick to allow even gray light to penetrate. Edmund walked to the chapel in continued darkness, and the service welcomed a light that could not yet be seen, but was trusted to arrive nonetheless. He sang the prayers with particular attention to this theme of faith, of trusting what could not be verified through immediate experience. The gospel reading told of seeds growing secretly, how the earth produced grain by itself, first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain, and Edmund contemplated the hidden work that preceded all visible manifestation. After Lauds came breakfast, and Edmund ate his porridge while listening to the reader speak of early Irish monasticism, of communities on remote islands where monks had built beehive cells of stone and lived in contemplation of sea and sky. The descriptions evoked in Edmund a sense of kinship with these distant brothers, how geography mattered less than the interior orientation that brought one to monastic life. Whether on an Irish island or in a Burgundian valley, the rhythm remained the same, the 7 prayer times marking the hours with unwavering constancy. Prime blessed the beginning of work, and Edmund made his way to the monastery bakehouse, where Brother Thomas had requested help with the day's bread making. The bakehouse occupied a stone building separate from the main monastery, designed so that heat and potential fire would not endanger the other structures. Edmund entered and was immediately enveloped by warmth, the great oven already radiating heat from fires lit in the pre-dawn hours. Brother Thomas was 49 years old, his flour-dusted hands strong and sure, his movements around the bakehouse reflecting decades of daily practice. He greeted Edmund with a nod and gestured toward the wooden trough where dough had been rising overnight, covered with damp linen cloths. Edmund removed the clothes carefully and looked at the pale mass that had expanded during the dark hours, transformed by the mysterious work of yeast consuming flour and water, and breathing out the gas that created countless tiny chambers within the dough. They worked together to divide the mass into portions, weighing each one to ensure equality, shaping them into rounds that would become the day's loaves. Edmund's calloused hands pressed and folded the dough, feeling how it responded to pressure, how it held a kind of memory in its gluten structure. The work had a rhythm that matched breathing, press and fold, and Edmund found himself entering that meditative state where thought dissolved into pure action. Brother Thomas worked alongside him, and they moved in silent coordination, their hands creating loaf after loaf that would feed the community through the coming day. The bakehouse smelled of flour and yeast, of the wood smoke that fed the oven's fire, and Edmund breathed deeply, feeling these scents becoming part of his body through the simple act of respiration. When all the loaves were shaped, Brother Thomas began placing them on wooden peels for transfer to the oven, and Edmund watched the flames dance behind the iron door as each loaf entered the heat. The bell for Terce called them from the bakehouse to the chapel, and Edmund walked through air that had begun to brighten slightly, though the sun remained hidden behind clouds. The brief service acknowledged the morning's progress, and Edmund chanted with his brothers, his voice steady despite the fatigue beginning to accumulate in his body from the early rising and the physical work. When Terce concluded, he returned to the bakehouse where the first loaves were ready to be removed from the oven. Brother Thomas used the long wooden peel to extract each loaf, their crusts golden and crackling, their internal steam escaping in fragrant clouds. Edmund helped transfer them to cooling racks, feeling the heat radiating from each loaf, hearing the subtle sounds the bread made as it cooled and its structure settled. They worked through the morning, baking batch after batch until enough bread had been produced for the day's needs. By the time Sext approached at midday, the bakehouse was filled with cooling loaves, their combined fragrance almost overwhelming in its richness. Edmund's hands were white with flour dust, and he washed them in a basin of water before walking to the chapel for the midday service. The prayers acknowledged the height of day, and Edmund felt balanced between morning and afternoon, held in the present moment by the structure that had governed his hours since before dawn. Dinner in the refectory featured the fresh bread Edmund had helped bake, still slightly warm with pottage and cheese and ale. He tasted his own labor in the bread, the particular texture and flavor that came from proper kneading and the right duration of rising. The reader's voice spoke of Saint Benedict's instructions regarding manual labor, how monks should not be so devoted to prayer that they neglected work, nor so devoted to work that they neglected prayer, but should hold both in proper balance. Edmund felt this balance in his own body, tired from baking, yet refreshed by the repeated gathering for prayer. After the meal came the rest period, and Edmund made his way to the cloister garden where he found a bench beneath the covered walkway. He sat and watched the gray sky, the motionless clouds that suggested rain would come eventually, but not yet. His breathing slowed, his body releasing the morning's accumulated tensions, and he felt himself sinking into a profound ease that required nothing and offered everything. Other monks occupied other spaces nearby, some reading, some simply resting as he rested, all held within the monastery's encompassing peace. The bell for none brought him back to fuller awareness, and he walked to the chapel where the afternoon service gathered the community once more. Edmund's voice joined his brothers' voices in the familiar chants, and he felt how these prayers had become woven into the very fabric of his being, inseparable from who he had become over 23 years of monastic life. When none concluded, he made his way to the herb garden where afternoon tasks awaited. The garden needed watering, as no rain had fallen to replenish what the plants consumed through their leaves and roots. Edmund drew water from the well, filling wooden buckets that he carried to the beds, pouring the water carefully around each plant's base. The work was repetitive and physically demanding, his arms and back soon aching from the weight of the buckets, but he found satisfaction in seeing the dry soil darken with moisture, in knowing the plants would be sustained through another cycle of growth. Brother William joined him after a while, and they worked in their usual parallel silence, drawing and carrying, until all the beds had received adequate water. Edmund's calloused hands gripped the bucket handles, and he felt how these same hands had held quills and vellum that morning, had shaped bread dough earlier, and had been offered in prayer multiple times throughout the day. They were instruments of work and worship both, and he felt gratitude for their continuing strength despite his 41 years. The afternoon wore on, and Edmund moved from watering to other tasks that the garden required. He removed spent blossoms from the herb flowers, encouraging the plants to produce new growth rather than setting seed. He checked for insects that might damage the tender leaves, removing them by hand when found. He adjusted stakes supporting taller plants that leaned under their own weight. Each small action contributed to the garden's overall health, and Edmund gave each one his full attention, not rushing toward completion, but simply being present with what was immediately before him. Vespers approached as the gray afternoon began its slow transition toward evening. Edmund stood from his work and walked to the chapel, where candles had been lit against the dimness. The evening prayer gathered the community, and Edmund sang the hymns with particular feeling, offering gratitude for another day lived within this rhythm. Through the windows he could see no sunset colors, only the gradual darkening of clouds, but the absence of visible beauty somehow made the interior beauty of the prayers more palpable. When Vespers concluded, they processed to the refectory for the simple evening meal. Edmund ate bread and cheese, drank his ale, and listened to the reader continue the lives of the saints. The stories spoke of perseverance through difficulty, of faith maintained when external circumstances offered no support or encouragement. Edmund thought about his own journey, how the monastery had not always felt like refuge, how there had been years of struggle before the rhythm had become natural, before life had revealed its hidden gifts. After the meal came recreation, and Edmund walked in the cloister as the first drops of rain began to fall. The promised weather had finally arrived, and he drew his hood over his graying auburn hair, feeling the wool protect him from the gentle precipitation. Other monks walked nearby, their presence a comfort in the wet darkness. The rain intensified gradually, and eventually they all retreated to the covered walkways, continuing their silent perambulation while protected from the downpour. Compline gathered them one final time, the day's last prayer offered in the candlelit chapel while rain drummed on the roof tiles overhead. The service commended them into divine care for the sleeping hours ahead, and Edmund sang with his brothers, his voice blending with theirs, and with the sound of falling rain to create a kind of music that went beyond mere sound. When the abbot offered the closing blessing, Edmund received it with bowed head and grateful heart, feeling how each day's rhythm brought him to this moment of surrender. In the dormitory, he removed his outer robe and lay down on his mattress beneath his wool blanket. His body ached pleasantly from the day's labors, and he felt fatigue pulling him toward sleep. Around him, his brothers settled into their own rest, the dormitory filling with the sound of slow breathing beneath the steady percussion of rain. Edmund closed his eyes and listened to the water falling on the monastery, washing the stones, nourishing the earth, participating in the vast cycles that governed all created things. His calloused hands rested on his chest, and he felt his breathing slowing, matching the deep quietness that lived beneath the rain's sound. Tomorrow would bring matins in the darkness before dawn, and the 7 prayer times would mark another day's passage, another turning of the wheel that held him. Edmund's consciousness began to release its grip on wakefulness, and his last thought before sleep claimed him was a wordless awareness of being held, of belonging to something larger than himself, something that had been and would be regardless of his individual participation, yet was somehow enriched by his daily offering of attention and presence. The rain fell steadily through the night, blessing the monastery and all who slept within its walls, and Edmund rested deeply, cradled in the ancient rhythm that had carried countless others before him and would carry countless others after, the 7 prayer times marking the hours like beads on an endless rosary, each day complete yet connected to all the days that had been and all the days yet to come. The bell for matins sounded through the rain-filled darkness, and Edmund rose from his mattress feeling the dampness in the air settle against his skin. He dressed slowly, his calloused hands finding the familiar folds of his robe, and walked through the cloister where rain still fell in steady sheets beyond the covered walkway. The sound of water on stone created a constant backdrop, and Edmund felt himself held within it as he made his way to the chapel where candlelight flickered in the wet darkness. In the choir stalls, he settled onto his bench and allowed the rhythm of the rain to merge with the rhythm of his breathing. The abbot's voice opened the service, and Edmund joined the chant, feeling how the Latin words flowed like the water outside, continuous and purposeful, moving toward an ocean he could sense but never fully comprehend. The psalms spoke of rivers and streams, of water springing up from the depths of the earth, and Edmund thought about how appropriate these texts were for this rain-soaked morning, how the ancient prayers seemed to respond to present circumstances despite having been written centuries ago in distant lands. The service moved through its appointed course, and Edmund found his attention deepening with each psalm, each reading, each response. His voice blended with his brothers' voices, creating harmonies that felt less like sound and more like presence, something substantial enough to hold and be held by. When matins concluded, he returned to the dormitory and lay down once more, listening to the rain's continued percussion, feeling how it created a kind of enclosure around the monastery, separating them gently from the wider world. Lauds came with no visible change in the darkness, the rain and clouds conspiring to delay any hint of dawn. Edmund walked to the chapel feeling the peculiar timelessness that came with such weather, when the usual markers of day's progression remained hidden. The service welcomed light that could not yet be seen, and Edmund sang the prayers with particular attention to this act of faith, this trusting in what remained invisible. The gospel reading told of the Good Shepherd, of sheep knowing their shepherd's voice, and Edmund contemplated how he had learned over decades to recognize the voice that called him to this life, how it spoke through the bell's summons and the community's rhythm and the silence between prayers. After Lauds came breakfast, and Edmund ate his porridge while listening to the reader speak of monastic architecture, of how builders designed spaces to serve prayer and work in equal measure. The description evoked in Edmund a deeper appreciation for the stones that surrounded him, how the cloisters covered walkways protected from rain while keeping the elements visible, how the chapel's high windows admitted light without creating distraction, how every space had been conceived with attention to the life that would unfold within it. Prime blessed the beginning of work, and Edmund made his way to the library where Brother Augustine had requested help organizing manuscripts that had arrived from another monastery. The library occupied a room on the second floor, where windows faced south to catch maximum light. Today, those windows showed only gray dimness, and extra candles had been lit on the reading tables to supplement the weak daylight filtering through the rain. Brother Augustine was 54 years old, his precise mind cataloging the monastery's collection with meticulous care, his movements deliberate and economical. He greeted Edmund with a slight nod and gestured to the stack of manuscripts waiting on a table near the window. Edmund examined them carefully, noting their size and binding style, reading the titles inscribed on their covers or first pages. Some were gospel books, others collections of saints' lives, still others treatises on monastic practice written by various abbots and spiritual teachers. They worked together through the morning, Edmund holding each manuscript open while Brother Augustine examined its contents and made notes regarding where it should be shelved. The work required patience and careful handling, as some of the manuscripts were quite old, their vellum pages fragile with age. Edmund found himself absorbed in the glimpses of text he caught as pages were turned, fragments of prayers and exhortations, descriptions of lives lived in devotion to the same rule that governed his own days. The bell for Terce called them from the library to the chapel, and Edmund walked down the stone stairs feeling his knees protest slightly at the descent. The brief service acknowledged the morning's progress, and Edmund chanted with his brothers, his voice steady despite the fatigue accumulating from work begun in darkness before true dawn had arrived. When Terce concluded, he returned to the library where Brother Augustine had already resumed examining the manuscripts. They continued their cataloging work through the late morning, the rain outside maintaining its steady rhythm. Edmund found comfort in the sound, in how it created a sense of enclosure and intimacy, as though the library had become a small island separate from time's normal flow. His hands moved carefully as he held each manuscript, supporting the spine properly to avoid damage, turning pages only when Brother Augustine indicated readiness to move forward. By the time Sext approached at midday, they had examined and cataloged roughly half the new manuscripts. Brother Augustine carefully placed bookmarks in those still requiring attention, and they walked together to the chapel for the midday service. The prayers acknowledged the height of day, though the rain-dimmed light made it difficult to distinguish midday from any other hour. Edmund felt a peculiar sense of existing outside normal time, held in a continuous present where past and future mattered less than this immediate moment of standing with his brothers and offering his voice to the ancient chants. Dinner in the refectory was pottage thick with root vegetables, bread from yesterday's baking, cheese aged in the monastery cellars. Edmund ate slowly, savoring each bite, listening to the reader speak of Saint Benedict's instructions regarding silence, how speech should be measured and purposeful, how the monastery should cultivate an atmosphere of quiet that allowed interior growth. Edmund thought about his own relationship with silence, how it had initially felt oppressive but had gradually become liberating, how he had discovered that silence was not absence but presence, not emptiness but fullness. After the meal came the rest period, and Edmund made his way to the chapter house where he had sat several days ago. He found the same stone bench and settled onto it, closing his eyes and simply breathing. The rain continued its steady drumming on the roof, and Edmund allowed the sound to wash through him, not resisting it or analyzing it, simply letting it be as it was. His breathing slowed, his body releasing accumulated tensions, and he felt himself sinking into a profound stillness where the boundaries between interior and exterior seemed to dissolve. Time passed without measure. Edmund sat in the darkness behind his closed eyelids, aware of the stone beneath him, the air moving gently through the space, the distant sound of his brothers going about their various tasks. He thought of nothing in particular, or perhaps he thought of everything at once, his mind holding a kind of spacious awareness that contained all experience without grasping at any particular element. When the bell for none eventually called him from this rest, he rose feeling refreshed in ways that transcended physical recuperation. The afternoon service gathered the community once more, and Edmund's voice joined his brothers' voices in the familiar chants. The prayers acknowledged the continuing day, blessed the work that remained, and Edmund felt how these repeated gatherings created a rhythm that was both structure and freedom, constraint and liberation. When none concluded, he returned to the library where Brother Augustine waited to resume their cataloging work. They worked through the afternoon, completing the examination of all the new manuscripts and determining their proper placement on the library shelves. Edmund helped carry volumes to their assigned locations, climbing the wooden ladder that reached the higher shelves, sliding each book into its designated space. The work had a satisfying quality of completion, of bringing order to what had been chaotic, of creating a system that would serve the community's needs for study and prayer. By the time they finished, the afternoon had advanced toward evening, though the rain-dimmed light made it difficult to judge the hour with certainty. Edmund walked to the chapel for Vespers, his body tired from the day's work but his mind clear and peaceful. The evening prayer gathered the community, and Edmund sang the hymns with deep feeling, offering gratitude for another day lived within the ancient rhythm. Through the windows he could see the rain continuing, the darkness deepening as night approached. When Vespers concluded, they processed to the refectory for the simple evening meal. Edmund ate bread and cheese, drank his ale, and listened to the reader continue the lives of the saints. The stories spoke of faithfulness maintained through long years without consolation, of trust sustained when God seemed absent or distant. Edmund recognized aspects of his own journey in these narratives, how the monastic life contained seasons of dryness as well as fertility, how both were necessary for growth that went beyond surface understanding. After the meal came recreation, and Edmund walked in the covered cloister while rain fell just beyond the arched openings. Other monks walked nearby, their presence a comfort in the wet darkness. Edmund breathed the rain-washed air, feeling how it carried the scent of wet stone and earth, of growing things being nourished. His calloused hands hung at his sides, and he noticed how they ached slightly from the day's work, how they bore the marks of decades spent in various labors, how they had become instruments serving purposes larger than his individual will. Compline gathered them one final time, the day's last prayer offered in the candle-lit chapel, while rain continued its steady percussion overhead. The service was subdued, the words speaking of rest and trust, of surrender into care beyond human understanding. Edmund sang with his brothers, his voice blending with theirs to create something that transcended individual contribution. And when the abbot offered the closing blessing, he received it with bowed head and grateful heart. In the dormitory, he removed his outer robe and lay down on his mattress beneath his wool blanket. His body settled into the straw with familiar ease, and he felt the day's accumulated experiences becoming part of the long memory that shaped who he was. Around him, his brothers settled into their own rest, the dormitory filling with the sound of slow breathing beneath the rain's constant rhythm. Edmund closed his eyes and listened to the water falling on the monastery, thinking about how the rain blessed all things equally, how it nourished the herbs in the garden and filled the cisterns and washed the stones clean without discrimination or preference. His breathing slowed to match the deep quietness beneath the rain's sound, and he felt consciousness beginning to release its grip on wakefulness. Tomorrow would bring matins in the darkness before dawn, and the 7 prayer times would mark another day's passage. Edmund's last thought before sleep claimed him was a wordless awareness of being part of something vast and enduring, something that held him as gently as the rain held the earth, as the darkness held the monastery, as the silence held all sound within its infinite capacity. The rain fell through the night, and Edmund slept deeply, cradled in rhythms both ancient and immediate, his 41 years dissolving into the timeless present where only peace remained. The monastery breathed around him, stone and wood and sleeping men all resting together, and the rain blessed everything it touched. The bell for matins sounded through the darkness, and Edmund opened his eyes to discover the rain had finally ceased. He rose from his mattress and dressed, noticing how the air had changed, carrying now a freshness that spoke of clearing skies. Walking to the chapel, he looked up through the cloister's arched openings and saw stars scattered across patches of black sky between departing clouds. The stones beneath his feet still held moisture from the long rain, and his footsteps made soft sounds as he joined the quiet procession of his brothers. In the choir stalls, Edmund settled onto his bench and felt a particular clarity settling over him, as though the rain had washed away not only the dust from the monastery walls, but also some accumulated residue from his own interior landscape. The abbot's voice opened the service, and Edmund joined the chant, his voice rising easily, feeling how the words flowed through him rather than from him. The psalms spoke of creation renewed, of morning stars singing together, and Edmund thought about how each day offered this same opportunity for renewal, for beginning again regardless of what had come before. The service moved through its appointed course, and Edmund found himself noticing details he had overlooked in previous services, how Brother Martin held his psalter at a particular angle to catch the candlelight, how the youngest novice still moved his lips slightly while reading the Latin texts, forming each word with visible care. These small observations brought Edmund a sense of tender affection for his community, for the way each brother brought his own particular presence to the shared prayer. When Matins concluded, he returned to the dormitory and lay down once more, but sleep seemed far away. Instead, he rested in a state of quiet wakefulness, listening to the silence that had replaced the rain's constant percussion. The quiet felt almost tangible, a presence rather than an absence, and Edmund allowed himself to be held by it until the bell for Lauds called him back to the chapel. The dawn service came with the first true light they had seen in 2 days, pale gold touching the eastern horizon and gradually spreading across the sky. Edmund watched through the chapel windows as the world revealed itself again, clouds breaking apart to show patches of blue between them. The service welcomed this returning light, and Edmund sang the prayers with deep gratitude, not only for the sun's return, but for the way the darkness and rain had created a particular kind of space that deepened his appreciation for illumination. After Lauds came breakfast, and Edmund ate his porridge while listening to the reader speak of monastic founders in distant centuries, of men and women who had established communities that persisted through wars and plagues and political upheavals. The stories reminded Edmund that the life he lived participated in something much larger than his individual experience, that he was one link in a chain extending backward into history and forward into futures he would never witness. The thought brought him both humility and comfort, a sense of being held within something vast and enduring. Prime blessed the beginning of work, and Edmund made his way to the herb garden where days of rain had caused vigorous new growth. The plants seemed almost luminous in the morning light, their leaves washed clean, their colors more vivid than he remembered. He knelt in the damp earth, his calloused hands beginning to pull weeds that had sprouted in the moisture, and he felt a particular joy in this return to the garden after days spent indoors. Brother William joined him after a few minutes, and they worked side by side in their usual companionable silence. The morning sun climbed higher, warming Edmund's back through his wool robe, and he felt his body relaxing into the familiar rhythm of the work. Birds sang with particular enthusiasm this morning, as though they too were celebrating the rain's departure, and Edmund found himself smiling slightly at their exuberance. The garden smelled intensely of growing things, the scents released by the sun's warmth acting on wet soil and foliage. Edmund breathed deeply, feeling how the aromatic air filled his lungs and seemed to spread throughout his body, nourishing something beyond mere physical need. His hands moved among the plants with practiced care, removing what didn't belong, encouraging what should remain. The work had become so familiar over his years in the monastery that it required little conscious thought, allowing his mind to rest in open awareness while his body performed its tasks. The bell for Terce called them from the garden to the chapel, and Edmund stood slowly, feeling his knees bear the now familiar ache of time spent kneeling. He walked through the cloister, where puddles still remained in low spots, catching and reflecting the sky's increasing blue. The brief service acknowledged the morning's progress, and Edmund chanted with his brothers, his voice steady and sure, feeling how these repeated gatherings created a rhythm that ordered not only his days but his interior life as well. Returning to the garden, Edmund took up a different task, trimming back plants that had grown leggy during the extended wet weather. He used small shears to remove excess growth, shaping each plant to encourage air circulation and prevent disease. The work required attention and judgment, deciding what to remove and what to preserve, and Edmund gave it his full focus. Small piles of trimmings accumulated around him, releasing their particular scents as the cut stems exposed their interior tissues to the air. Brother William worked nearby doing similar trimming, and occasionally they would exchange glances, a silent checking in that required no words but created a sense of shared purpose. The morning wore on, and Edmund continued his steady progress through the beds. His calloused hands gripped the shears, opening and closing, and he felt how even this simple tool had become an extension of his intention, how years of use had made its operation completely natural. By the time Sext approached at midday, Edmund had trimmed most of the established plants and gathered the cuttings into neat piles for composting. The garden looked tidier now, more ordered, and he felt satisfaction in seeing the results of his labor. The bell called him to the chapel, and he walked through the now bright cloister, squinting slightly at the sunlight after days of gray dimness. The midday service felt celebratory somehow, colored by the returned light, and Edmund sang the prayers with particular energy. Dinner in the refectory featured fresh greens from the garden, their flavor sharp and vital, along with pottage and bread and cheese. Edmund ate slowly, savoring the complexity of tastes, listening to the reader speak of Saint Benedict's instructions regarding humility, how true self-knowledge came not through self-examination alone, but through patient submission to community life, through allowing others to reveal aspects of oneself that remained invisible to interior observation. Edmund thought about his own journey toward humility, how it had required decades of practice, how he still sometimes caught himself in pride or judgment before remembering to return to simple presence. After the meal came the rest period, and Edmund found himself drawn to the library once more. He sat in his favored chair near the window, where afternoon sun now streamed through glass, creating patterns of light on the wooden floor. He did not read, but simply sat, watching dust motes drift through the illuminated air, thinking about how everything was always in motion even when appearing still, how the solid monastery participated in the same fundamental flux that governed clouds and water and all created things. His breathing slowed, his body releasing into the chair's support, and he felt himself entering that state of profound rest where consciousness remained present but attachment to thoughts dissolved. Time passed without measure, and Edmund simply sat, held by the sunlight and silence, requiring nothing, offering nothing, simply being present to what was. When the bell for none eventually called him from this rest, he rose feeling renewed in ways that had nothing to do with physical recuperation. The afternoon service gathered the community once more, and Edmund's voice joined his brothers' voices in the familiar chants. The prayers acknowledged the continuing day, blessed the work that remained, and Edmund felt how these repeated gatherings created anchors in time, fixed points around which the day's other activities could organize themselves. When none concluded, he made his way back to the herb garden where afternoon tasks awaited. The compost piles needed turning, a task that Edmund approached with the same unhurried attention he brought to all work. He used a broad fork to lift and turn the decomposing plant matter, seeing how yesterday's trimmings had already begun to wilt and soften, how older material had transformed almost completely into rich, dark soil. The process fascinated him, how death and decay were not endings but transformations, how what appeared to be loss was actually changed into different forms. He thought about his own eventual death, how his body would return to earth just as these plant trimmings were returning, how nothing was truly lost but only changed. Brother William appeared and helped with the turning, and they worked in their usual parallel silence, moving from pile to pile until all had been properly aerated. The work was physically demanding, and Edmund felt sweat gathering on his forehead despite the moderate temperature. His arms and back engaged fully with the task, and he welcomed the exertion, the way it brought him completely into his body, leaving no space for mental wandering or abstraction. The afternoon wore on, and Edmund moved from composting to other tasks the garden required. He checked the irrigation channels, clearing away debris that had accumulated during the rain. He inspected plants for signs of disease or pest damage, finding little but remaining vigilant. He adjusted stakes and ties, ensuring everything was properly supported. Each small action contributed to the garden's overall health, and Edmund gave each one his full attention, not rushing toward completion, but simply being present with what was immediately before him. Vespers approached as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Edmund stood from his work and walked to the chapel, where the evening prayer gathered the community for the penultimate service of the day. His voice rose with his brothers' voices, singing the hymns that marked the day's ending, offering gratitude for hours lived and work accomplished. Through the windows, the sky blazed with color, and Edmund felt his heart expanding to hold both the beauty of the moment and the knowledge of its inevitable passing. When Vespers concluded, they processed to the refectory for the simple evening meal. Edmund ate bread and cheese, drank his ale, and listened to the reader continue the lives of the saints. The stories spoke of ordinary lives made extraordinary through sustained attention to the sacred in the midst of the mundane, and Edmund felt these narratives affirming his own path, validating the choice to seek holiness not through dramatic gesture but through faithful showing up, day after day, year after year. After the meal came recreation, and Edmund walked in the cloister as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of evening. The air had cooled significantly, carrying the crispness that came after clearing storms. He drew his hood over his graying auburn hair, feeling the wool settle against his skin, and continued his slow circuit of the covered walkway. Other monks walked nearby, their presence a comfort in the gathering darkness, and Edmund felt surrounded by silent companionship. Compline gathered them one final time, the day's last prayer offered in the candlelit chapel as night completed its claim on the world. The service commended them into divine care for the sleeping hours ahead, and Edmund sang with his brothers, his voice blending with theirs in the subdued chants. When the abbot offered the closing blessing, Edmund received it with bowed head and open heart, feeling how each day brought him to this moment of surrender, of releasing control and trusting what lay beyond human understanding. In the dormitory, he removed his outer robe and lay down on his mattress beneath his wool blanket. His body settled into the straw with familiar ease, tired from the day's labors but peaceful. Around him, his brothers settled into their own rest, the dormitory filling with the sound of slow breathing. Edmund closed his eyes and felt his own breathing slowing, matching the deep quietness of the monastery at night. Tomorrow would bring Matins in the darkness before dawn, and the 7 prayer times would mark another day's passage, another turning of the wheel that held him in its ancient rhythm. Edmund's consciousness began to release its grip on wakefulness, and his last thought before sleep claimed him as a wordless gratitude for the gift of this life, for the community that surrounded him, for the structure that held him day by day, hour by hour, prayer by prayer. The stars wheeled overhead in their appointed courses, and Edmund slept deeply, cradled in rhythms both immediate and eternal. The bell for Matins sounded through the clear darkness, and Edmund opened his eyes to find the dormitory filled with the deep quiet that comes after storms have passed. He rose from his mattress and dressed, his calloused hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind remained soft and receptive to the new day. Walking to the chapel, he noticed how the stars shone with particular brilliance in the washed sky, their light steady and ancient, and he felt a connection to all the monks throughout history who had looked up at these same constellations during their own journeys to pray. In the choir stalls, Edmund settled onto his bench and allowed his breathing to deepen as the abbot began the opening prayer. His voice joined the chant, the Latin words flowing easily after decades of repetition, and he felt how the service had become less an obligation and more a gift, an opportunity to participate in something that transcended his individual existence. The Psalms spoke of mountains and seas, of the vast sweep of creation bearing witness to its creator, and Edmund thought about his own small place within this immensity, how even the smallest participation carried meaning. The service moved through its appointed course, and Edmund found himself noticing the quality of silence between the chanted portions, how these pauses held as much significance as the words themselves, creating space for what could not be spoken. When Matins concluded, he returned to the dormitory and lay down once more, not seeking sleep but simply resting in the darkness, allowing his body to release into the mattress while his mind remained gently alert. Lauds came with dawn painting the eastern sky in shades of pearl and rose, the colors gradual and subtle in their progression. Edmund walked to the chapel feeling the day beginning to take shape, and the service welcomed the returning light with particular joy after the days of rain and clouds. He sang the prayers with his brothers, his voice steady, and felt gratitude rising in him like water from a deep well. Gratitude for this rhythm that had shaped his days for 23 years. Gratitude for the community that held him. Gratitude for the simple fact of being alive to witness another sunrise. After Lauds came breakfast, and Edmund ate his porridge while listening to the reader speak of monastic customs in different regions, how various communities had adapted the rule to their particular circumstances while maintaining its essential spirit. The narrative reminded Edmund that unity did not require uniformity, that the same underlying principles could manifest in different ways depending on landscape and culture. He thought about how his own monastery reflected the character of Burgundy, its stone buildings and vineyard-covered slopes, its particular saints and histories. Prime blessed the beginning of work, and Edmund made his way to the monastery workshop, where Brother Gerard had requested help repairing tools that had accumulated during the wet weather. The workshop occupied a stone building near the stables, where the sounds of various crafts mingled with the scent of metal and wood and leather. Brother Gerard was 56 years old, his skilled hands capable of mending almost anything, his movements economical and precise from decades of practice. Edmund examined the tools waiting for attention: hoes with loose handles, shears with dulled blades, rakes missing tines. Brother Gerard showed him how to secure a loose handle, driving wooden wedges into the socket to create a tight fit, and Edmund set to work with careful attention. The task required patience and judgment, determining the right size wedge for each tool, tapping it into place with measured strikes of a wooden mallet. The work had a satisfying quality of restoration, of returning something broken to usefulness. They worked side by side through the morning, Brother Gerard sharpening blades on a whetstone while Edmund secured handles and replaced broken parts. The workshop filled with the sounds of their labor, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone, the tap of mallet on wood, the occasional clatter as a repaired tool was set aside. Edmund found himself entering that familiar state where thought dissolved into pure action, his hands knowing what to do without need for conscious direction. The bell for Terce called them from the workshop to the chapel, and Edmund washed his hands in a basin of water before walking through the bright morning to join his brothers. The brief service acknowledged the progress of the day, and Edmund chanted with particular awareness of how these repeated gatherings created a kind of musical structure. The 7 prayer times like notes in a composition that spanned from darkness to darkness, encompassing all the hours between. Returning to the workshop, Edmund resumed his work on the tools. He had developed a rhythm now, moving efficiently from one implement to the next, and he felt satisfaction in seeing the pile of repaired tools growing while the pile awaiting attention diminished. Brother Gerard worked steadily nearby, his movements unhurried but purposeful, and occasionally their eyes would meet in silent acknowledgement of the shared labor. By the time Sext approached midday, they had repaired most of the accumulated tools and organized them for return to their various users throughout the monastery. Edmund stood and stretched his back, feeling muscles that had tightened during the morning's work, and walked to the chapel for the midday service. The prayers acknowledged the height of day, and Edmund felt balanced between morning and afternoon, held in the present moment by the structure that governed his hours. Dinner in the refectory featured fish from the monastery ponds, prepared with herbs from the garden Edmund tended. He tasted his own contribution to the meal, the subtle flavoring of dill and parsley that complemented the fish without overwhelming its delicate taste. The reader's voice spoke of contemplative prayer, of how it differed from vocal prayer by moving beyond words into silent presence, and Edmund thought about his own journey into this deeper kind of attention, how it had come not through effort but through patient waiting, through years of showing up and allowing the practice to work its slow transformation. After the meal came the rest period, and Edmund made his way to the cloister garden where he found his usual bench beneath the covered walkway. He sat and closed his eyes, not seeking anything particular, simply allowing his body to rest while his mind remained gently aware. The afternoon sun warmed the air, and he could hear bees working among the flowers in the central garden, their humming a peaceful backdrop to the silence. Time passed without measure, and Edmund sat in that state of profound ease where boundaries between interior and exterior seemed to soften, where he was simultaneously himself and part of something much larger. When the bell for none eventually called him from this rest, he rose feeling refreshed and centered, ready to continue the day's remaining tasks. The afternoon service gathered the community once more, and Edmund's voice joined his brothers' voices in the familiar chants. The prayers acknowledged the continuing day, blessed the work that remained, and Edmund felt how these gatherings created rhythm not only in time but in his interior life, regular opportunities to return attention to what mattered most deeply. When none concluded, he made his way to the monastery cellars where Brother Dominic needed help organizing the stored provisions. The cellars extended beneath the main buildings, cool stone chambers where the monastery kept its reserves of grain and cheese, its barrels of ale and wine, its preserved vegetables and dried fruits. Brother Dominic was 68 years old, his methodical mind tracking every item that entered or left the stores, his record-keeping ensuring the community would have adequate provisions through winter. He greeted Edmund with a nod and gestured to sacks of grain that needed to be shifted to make room for the coming harvest. Edmund set to work lifting and moving the heavy sacks, his body engaging fully with the physical demand. The work was strenuous, and he felt sweat gathering despite the cellar's coolness. His calloused hands gripped the rough fabric of the sacks, and his legs and back bore the weight as he carried each one to its new location. The repetitive motion created a meditative quality, and Edmund found his breathing synchronizing with the work, inhaling as he lifted, exhaling as he set the sack down. Brother Dominic worked alongside him, and they moved through the cellars in coordinated silence, reorganizing the stores with practiced efficiency. The cool air smelled of earth and grain, of aging cheese and fermenting fruit, and Edmund breathed these scents deeply, feeling how they spoke of the monastery's work throughout the year, the accumulated labor of many hands creating abundance that would sustain them through lean times. The afternoon wore on, and Edmund continued his steady work until all the grain had been properly reorganized. His body ached pleasantly from the exertion, and he felt satisfied with what they had accomplished. Brother Dominic examined the reorganized stores and nodded his approval, making notes in his ledger about the new arrangement. Vespers approached as Edmund emerged from the cellars into the late afternoon light. He walked to the chapel where the evening prayer gathered the community, and his voice rose with his brothers' voices, singing the hymns that marked the day's ending. Through the western windows, the sky blazed with sunset colors, orange and pink and purple layered in horizontal bands, and Edmund felt his heart opening to receive this beauty, to hold it without grasping, to appreciate it while knowing it would pass. When Vespers concluded, they processed to the refectory for the simple evening meal. Edmund ate bread and cheese, drank his ale, and listened to the reader continue the lives of the saints. The stories spoke of hidden holiness, of people whose virtue remained unknown during their lifetimes, but was revealed after death through the fruits their lives had borne. Edmund thought about his own life, how he would likely die without recognition beyond this community, how his days would leave no visible mark on history. Yet somehow this seemed exactly right, exactly what he had been seeking when he first arrived at the monastery gates as a young man of 18. After the meal came recreation, and Edmund walked in the cloister as the sky darkened and stars began appearing overhead. The air held the coolness of spring evenings, and he drew his hood over his graying auburn hair, feeling grateful for the wool's warmth. Other monks walked nearby, their presence a comfort in the gathering darkness, and Edmund felt surrounded by brothers in the deepest sense, men who shared not only living space but commitment to a way of being that transcended individual preference or convenience. Compline gathered them one final time, the day's last prayer offered in the candlelit chapel as night claimed the world. The service was subdued, the words speaking of rest and trust, of surrender into divine care for the sleeping hours ahead. Edmund sang with his brothers, his voice blending with theirs in the gentle chants, and when the abbot offered the closing blessing, he received it with bowed head and grateful heart, feeling how each day brought him to this moment of letting go. In the dormitory, he removed his outer robe and lay down on his mattress beneath his wool blanket. His body settled into the straw with familiar ease, tired from the day's labors but deeply peaceful. Around him, his brothers settled into their own rest, the dormitory filling with the sound of slow breathing. Edmund closed his eyes and felt his own breathing slowing, matching the deep quietness of the monastery at night. Tomorrow would bring Matins in the darkness before dawn, and the 7 prayer times would mark another day's passage, another turning of the eternal wheel. Edmund's consciousness began to release its grip on wakefulness, and his last thought before sleep claimed him was a wordless awareness of gratitude, of belonging, of being held within rhythms that had carried countless others before him and would carry countless others after, each day a pearl on an endless strand, each hour marked by prayer, each moment held in the vast compassion that sustained all things. The stars wheeled overhead in their appointed courses, and Edmund slept deeply, his 41 years dissolving into the timeless present where only peace remained, and the monastery breathed around him, stone and wood and sleeping men all resting together in the ancient silence. The morning air held a particular stillness as Edmund continued his work in the days that followed. the rhythm of the 7 prayer times marking each hour with their gentle constancy. His calloused hands moved through the familiar tasks, tending the herb garden where new growth flourished under spring's lengthening light, the plants reaching upward with the same patient determination that had carried him through 23 years of monastic life. The bells continued to call, and Edmund continued to answer, his footsteps wearing their own small groove into the cloister stones as generations of monks had done before him. Each service brought him back to the chapel, back to the voices of his brothers blending with his own, back to the ancient words that had been offered in darkness and light for centuries beyond counting. The rhythm had become inseparable from his breathing, from the beating of his heart, from the quiet contentment that had grown in him like the herbs grew in their beds, slowly and without fanfare, but with undeniable presence. Brother William worked beside him in the garden, their companionship requiring no words, only the shared understanding that came from years of common purpose. The monastery cat dozed in patches of sunlight. The swallows returned to their nests under the eaves. The vines in the vineyard continued their patient climb toward the sun. Everything participated in the same cycles, the same rhythms of growth and rest, work and prayer, darkness and light following one another in their appointed order. Edmund paused in his work and looked up at the sky, where clouds drifted in shapes that would never repeat, each moment unique yet held within patterns as ancient as creation itself. He thought of nothing in particular, simply standing with his work-reddened hands resting at his sides, his graying auburn hair stirring slightly in the breeze, his 41 years gathered quietly within him like water in a deep well. The bell for the next prayer time would ring soon, and he would walk once more to the chapel, and his voice would join the voices of his brothers, and the words would rise like incense toward heaven. Tomorrow would bring the same pattern, and the day after that, each one complete in itself yet connected to all the others, the 7 prayer times marking the hours like beads on a rosary that had no ending, only the eternal return to the same source, the same silence, the same vast compassion that held all things. Edmund returned his attention to the herb bed before him, kneeling once more in the earth, his hands resuming their work among the growing plants, and everything was exactly as it should be.